Hey! This time, let's talk about spacing. Spacing is one of the most important individual concepts in Street Fighter. It's all about controlling the stage, and by controlling the stage, you're controlling your opponent's options. Now, this is important for every character, but it's more important for some, or it's more obvious at least for some, and especially for Dhalsim. Dhalsim is a character that is almost entirely space dependent. Where you are on the stage versus your opponent as Dhalsim has a huge impact on how you play. And you want to be as preemptive as possible. You do not want to let the opponent into certain areas. You want to make sure that you cage them in to a couple very particular locations. In order to illustrate this, I'm going to be looking at the recent matches between a Mr. Umehara Daigo, who apparently uses Ryu. We'll see how that goes for him. And another pretty famous guy, Arturo Sanchez, aka Sabin, one of the best Dhalsims in the world. Before we start this, I want you to think about 4 different distances between Dhalsim and Ryu, and what they mean. The first is at Dhalsim's stand fierce range, which is a winning location for Dhalsim. The second is at the range where if Ryu were to jump, he would land right on top of Dhalsim. This is also a winning location for Dhalsim. But in between those two, there's a range where Ryu does a little bit better, and then obviously within Ryu's jump arc range, at the range where he can start playing actual footsies and really pressuring Dhalsim, that's definitely a winning location for Ryu. So think about those different spots on screen and how Sabin, the Dhalsim player, is trying to make sure that he keeps one of those 2 good locations for him, and Daigo, the Ryu player, is trying to make sure that he gets into one of his better locations, especially into the up-close situation. Notice which one of those 4 locations the 2 characters start off at. This is the spot where if Ryu were to jump, Dhalsim would get a free anti-air. It's also the range where throwing a fireball is a little bit more risky, and it's also a range where if you were to try to walk forward, he'd probably just run into some normal. So this is one of the bad locations for Daigo. He'd rather be just a little bit farther away than this, and he has a couple different ways to get there. One is on his own by walking backwards or backdashing backwards. If he were to jump backwards, he'd be too far, and so what he does instead is he just blocks and waits for Sabin to push him backwards. Sabin does, and then as soon as Daigo gets there, he starts up his own offense. Let's look at this battle for the control of positional advantage early on. The 2 characters start moving backwards towards Daigo's side of the corner, and they both do it for different reasons. Sabin is doing it because he does not want to be in the current spot. He wants to be either a little bit farther than that, where he can pester Daigo with standing fierces, or a little bit closer than that, like at the range from the start of the round. But this current range is a bad one for him, because Daigo can jump here. Yes, Sabin could anti-air him, but it's really just a mix-up as to which anti-air he would use, which jump attack Daigo would use, and it's a mix-up that he doesn't necessarily want to get involved in, because if he guesses wrong, he could lose a third of his life and end up in a really bad situation. Daigo knows that, of course, and so he does move backwards to try to get into this spot where he can jump. Basically what he's doing is he's moving backwards so that he can move forwards. Upon landing, Daigo is now pretty close, but he doesn't really have the tools yet to be super annoying. He doesn't have meter for FADC, Dragon Punch FADC, he doesn't have Super, he doesn't have Ultra, and so he prefers to just kind of play a patient waiting game. He backs up a little bit, back into that range where he can jump again. Let's back up 1 second. At this range, Sabin really wants to push Daigo back just a little bit further, because just a little bit further than this is the range where Sabin really starts to dominate with his far stand fierce. Daigo recognizes this, and just before Sabin's stand fierce here would have touched him to push him back, he does a jump at a range where he can still jump. Because he's jumping while Sabin is doing the stand fierce, Sabin can't try to anti-air it even if he wanted to. As soon as Daigo lands, Sabin is there to make sure that he pushes Daigo back to a situation that's better for Sabin. So he throws out that back medium kick to push Daigo back. He then throws a quick stand short to push Daigo back even further. And recognize that the reason for those 2 moves is not necessarily to deal damage. Obviously, it would have been nice if they had dealt damage for some reason, but really the goal is to push Daigo back to a better location for Dhalsim. Location is so important for Dhalsim because it's really only at particular locations that he's a threat to deal damage. So those 2 moves are really just to build a situation where he can deal damage further on. And in fact, right after that, Sabin is at a range where his far stand fierce will hit anything that Daigo does, but is basically safe on whiff. So he throws out a stand fierce just in case it might deal damage. It doesn't, but it still means that Sabin is at a great range to control the match. So now we're like 5 minutes into this video and only 10 seconds into the game time. So I'm going to let it run a little bit
But you can see here what the consequences of Sabin's pushing Daigo back into that bad situation and also into the corner are. He gets stand fierce pressure, he can slide toward into anti-airs, he's basically in total control of the match. Daigo tries to get back to that location where he can jump, he tries to get closer, but in both cases he doesn't really succeed. Sabin is anti-airing him well, is controlling him with those stand fierce as well, and he basically whittles Daigo's life down. You can see that the entire outcome of this round is dictated by the battle for control of space early on.
I think you pretty much get the point, right? The player who controls the screen usually wins, or at least has a much better chance of winning than the other guy. There's lots of other stuff that can come into play, like mix-ups or screw-ups, or the opponent can have some character like Rufus who only needs to get in once to destroy Dalsum. But for the most part, and in most matchups, spacing is a giant factor. You have to realize which ranges your own character wants to play at. If I'm Zangief, I really want to do all that I can to get right up close. If I'm Dalsum, I want to make sure that you're at one of a very particular few ranges. And there are lots of different characters in between that have different spacings where they want to be at. For characters like Ryu and a whole bunch of other characters, your preferred location or your sweet spot just changes depending on the matchup. So whereas Ryu wants to get in against Dalsum, he doesn't really want to get in against Zangief and so on. When I'm thinking about spacing, I kind of think about the stage as like a graph with a series of waves plotted on it. And those waves represent where my character is good, and then the little troughs represent where my character is bad. I want to make always sure that I'm standing within the wave. And where that wave is, obviously, again, depends on your character. If you're Dalsum against Ryu, there's like two waves, and then there are a couple troughs, and you want to make sure that you're standing in one of those waves. If you're Zangief, there's pretty much only one, and it's right next to your opponent. So just as you're walking around, imagine that there's some imaginary wave and trough walking with you, and make sure that you're always within that wave. As with the traps video that I posted earlier, you really need to figure out where your sweet spots are before you start playing. So just like you need to design your traps beforehand and then look in-game for when you can spring them, you need to figure out which ranges you want to be standing at before you even play, and then be looking constantly to try to make sure that you're standing at that range. And in fact, spacing and traps are often related in that a good spacing, a good location on screen, can often either serve as a trap or can be the setup for another trap. Let's go back to this Sabin versus Daigo round for a second to illustrate what trap by spacing can be. So here, Sabin sets up this EX Fireball and then dashes toward. Well, what's Daigo really going to do here? He has no good options. Once he's in that corner, in that spacing, he pretty much has Jump, which will get him anti-aired. He has Fireball, which might just get him a Fierce in the face. He has any other normal, which can also get him hit. And he has Random Dragon Punch, which is pretty unlikely to work. And so he's pretty much just stuck. He needs to guess his way out, and nothing he's going to do is really going to help him out all that much. As you see, he goes for a jump and gets anti-aired, gets put right back into that situation, and then is dead like 2 seconds later. Thanks for watching. I'm glad you guys like this. I'm not really sure when the next one will be. It's really just dependent on how busy I am and how interested I am in doing it. But yeah, sure, I'll take requests. So post up or send me a message on YouTube or Shoryuken or Twitter or some other outlet, and let me know what you want to see next.